Hi everyone, today I'm going to show you how to service the bottom bracket of a BMX style bike. I can already see there's a lot of play here. You can probably hear it. In fact, you can definitely see it. So this crank arm is definitely loose, but actually I think the whole bottom bracket is loose as well. So rather than suffer with old ball bearings, which have probably been exposed to grime and grit and everything else, we're going to service the whole thing and put it back together again. So the first thing we need to do is to remove the tension from this bolt. Giddy on, it's hardly any. For me, this is a 6mm hex bolt. Then we undo the retainer. I'll explain how these work together at the end of the video. So this one comes completely off, and these just come loose, which they already were. And once I've undone this, I'm going to stop the video and do it on the other side as well. So this comes off. Goodness me, I don't know if you can see the rust on the camera through here, but this has been exposed to all the elements, so it's going to give me a fair bit of work to do. But once it's sorted, it will be good as new. Okay, so this is how we get this one off, and we then remove the chain from the bike. Goodness me, it's proper seized. Okay, chain is off. Now hopefully this will just come off with a bit of a tug. Let's have a look. There we go. So that is off, really grimy. So we're going to give this a good old clean with a wire brush inside and make sure all the contacts and all the grime is taken from it. We're going to do the same on the other side, off camera, and then we'll get onto the nitty gritty. Now that both crank arms are off, we can give both crank arms a good clean off camera. We can clean all this up as well. And most likely, if it's grubby and gross inside, which this one is, then between the threads here, it's going to be really knackered as well. These are the threads of the spindle that goes all the way through, essentially the axle that joins the two crank arms. Now, for getting this off, it's already very, very loose, which is half the problem. If you were struggling with it, with this retainer nut, it's a lock nut actually, being really tight, you just need to get the right sized spanner head, and you're not going to be undoing it in a classic lefty-loosey anti-clockwise fashion. You're actually going to be going clockwise. The reason being, when you're pedaling, it's going in the correct direction, so things don't loosen themselves or over tighten themselves the way you wouldn't want them to go. So the fact that this goes that way is a positive thing because it holds everything in place. Okay, now this part, you can get a special tool, which if you're going online to find out how to do this, you probably don't have the tool to hand. So the alternative is for you to get, although this is loose anyway, that's half the problem, but if this were tight up, remember we're going clockwise to undo. You can get the end of a screwdriver, and possibly with someone helping you by holding the other end, you can use a screwdriver and then a rubber mallet to wallop the two together. And if you catch it right, you shouldn't cause too much damage to these teeth, and you can work this loose. As I say, this is really loose anyway, which is half the problem. Now we're working live here because I haven't looked inside here yet, but looking at the gunk already, that looks like to be very old grease to me, although the ball bearings are looking in pretty good shape. But you can see already that the ball bearings are in their cage, and I'm holding the spindle on the other side. By undoing this, we can remove the whole lot. This is going to come off this way, what I'm unscrewing. The spindle's going to come through very easily with the chain ring, and the whole lot's going to come out of that side. And inside, you are going to have two cages. You're going to have this and another one of these on the other side. This is a cage holding the bearings. Now I'm going to service this, and I'm going to replace the ball bearings with new ones, and I'm going to do it without the cage. If you want an easy life, get ones in the cages, but if you want to be more effective, then ditch the cage and use a load of grease to put the ball bearings in separately. It's entirely up to you. Unless you're doing the Tour de France, it's not really going to matter. But there we go. That's stage 1, getting everything out. Stage 2, cleaning. Stage 3, getting everything back together again. Now that everything's clean, we can put everything back together again. It looks wet inside. It's not, it's just, that's what clean paint looks like. What I've also done, and it might be a good idea for you too, is cleaned up just around the areas where it will be harder to get to once the chain ring is back on, but that's entirely up to you. Now, when it comes to reinstalling the ball bearings, this is where your bike grease comes into play. And it's a case of liberally putting the grease around the contact area where the ball bearings are going to meet, all the way around. Now, I like to use loose ball bearings, and when bikes come out of the factories, usually they're in cages just to aid putting back in, basically. There's less to hang around and less to fall around. So it's up to you what you want to use. I was going to replace with loose ball bearings, but actually looking at the cages that were there, the ball bearings themselves are still in really good nick. I'm not a fan of putting things into landfill unnecessarily, so I've cleaned up the ball bearing cages, the ball bearings themselves, and I'm going to chuck them straight back in again. You need to be careful that you're going to put them back in the right way, but I've pre-greased these. They're going to go back in like this, facing outwards, and the recess, the concave area of this bottom bracket will also be meeting a concave area of the chain ring, or the actual the axle that's going to go through the spindle, and that in itself, the spindle by the chain ring, that has a similar recess. So the two are going to meet, and the ball bearings are going to swing nicely over the two. So what we're going to do is put a little bit more grease on here, work it around, and that's going to be just perfect. If I find there's going to be a bit of grinding or some feeling of scrapiness or grittiness, then what I'll do is I'll take these out and have another look. But there's a little bit of old grease in here, but not that I can see of actual grittiness. It should be fine. Anyway, we'll chuck this back in. Although it's dirty on the outside, it's nice and clean as a whistle on the inside. And off camera, I'm going to do exactly the same on the other side by putting in the cages with lots of grease, and then I'll show you the final stage. So now we're on the non-drive side, and this is the part to install the locking mechanism, the locking part of the spindle of the bottom bracket to hold everything in place and all together. Now, this has also got a recess. People often refer to it as cup and cone, where the two recesses meet each other over the ball bearings to create a nice working surface. Now, obviously, we can crush these ball bearings by over-tightening, so we need to be careful on how to do that. And we also need to make sure we don't cross-thread this when going back on. In a nutshell, folks, if it doesn't screw in nice and easily, just with the lightest of touches from thumb and finger, you're cross-threading. Now, if it's also feeling a bit grindy or a bit sticky as you're tightening, chances are your threads are still gunked up, but this one is relatively simple. And just as I mentioned earlier on, we are going lefty-loosey for the actual tightening. It's the opposite thread. Now, it will take ages to go in, and the reason for that is because the threads are really close, which means you can make very minor adjustments without massively moving the spindle back and forth in terms of tightness. So for this system here, we're going to keep going round, and this is the same with pretty much every ball bearing system that bikes have: headsets, wheel bearings, and here with the bottom bracket. We don't want to over tighten, as I've said, because we're going to crush the ball bearings, which will make them inoperable. It will damage them, it will dent them. It'll also damage the cup and cone, the recesses that the ball bearings are stuck in. But at the same time, we don't want it to be too loose, so there's too much play. Now, if you get hold of your thumb and finger on both ends, front and back, you can hear a bit of a chunking backwards and forwards here. So we're going to tighten it a bit more. Fingers, my finger just off camera, just move this groove up slightly. Now that stopped altogether. I thought that would take longer. So again, if we have it a bit too loose, there we go. You can probably hear that. We're going to bring this round just so it's finger tight. Still a bit some play there. My fingernail has just pushed it around a bit more. I've got fingernails of steel. A very slight play I can feel, slight knocking I can feel through my thumb and finger. That's gone. That is all gone. So the secret now is, now that that is bang on in place, we need to put on the washer between the two surfaces, and then the lock nut, and the lock nut holds this in place. So this washer is just to stop the two getting stuck together, essentially. It's always good to have a washer between two parts that are in place. So this is going to go on. There we go. There's a slight tooth here on the washer that goes in, and there's a slight groove here, so the two marry up. And then for the lock nut, it looks a bit grubby on the outside, but that's wear as opposed to dirt. Now we're going to do left or anti-clockwise again, but this is the lock nut which is going to be tightened. You'll remember that I undone this with a spanner or wrench earlier on. This is going to go on as tight as we can do it without being stupid. But this first pit that we moved on with this groove in here that I moved on my fingernail, that can't move. So it's a bit of a gift here, a bit of a skill, and if you've got all the right tools, happy days. But actually, you should be able to do it just perfectly if you're careful with the spanner that you've got. So we're going to tighten this up, and we don't want this groove to move. So you can keep an eye on that. So we're tightening up. It's going to take a little while because there we go. It's starting to move. I don't know if you saw that. There we go. It's not moving. The spindle itself is moving, so we're all good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep it like that for now. And there's no play, there's no knocking. I think we're in business. It's moving freely as well, which is great. Lovely. And what we're going to do now is put on the crank arm, and that will help then give some leverage, something to hold on to make sure this is super tight. And now it's time to get the first crank arm back on. It just slides on. But if I can bring this round a little bit, you'll hopefully see a bit of a gap here where my finger is. That gap needs to be closed. And the way it works is by first installing the lock bolt, which has probably got another name as well, but I call it a lock bolt. And the way this works is it takes away that excess. So it basically pushes the crank arm into the correct place. So we're going to give this a quick tighten. And then I'll show you afterwards how it moves the crank arm in place. Okay, as I'm tightening, you should see the crank arm moving inwards. There you go. It's a bit hard to show you, but you'll have to trust me, it's doing it. So we tighten this in to the point where the crank arm can go no further. Not stupidly over tightened, it's just how it needs to be. And then for this one, this does need to be done up pretty tight. Always go to your recommended manufacturer settings for torque settings, but certainly for the purposes of the video, you will know it by feel whether things are loose or not. Now, if you remember that lock nut we tightened earlier on, now's a good opportunity to, using the crank arm, to tighten this up. It's also a good opportunity to grab the crank and go backwards and forwards and just feel if there's any play. If there is a knocking, a bit of play, then remember we've got to move this inner, the wider nut further round anti-clockwise. But either way, we then use this lock nut. As it happens, if things are a bit loose, and this part always does move as you tighten the lock nut because of too much friction, you can actually work the two together quite niftily. But you can see this is moving quite a lot. So I need to work a way around getting this tight without over tightening the bottom bracket. Now there's a grinding in there. So after the purpose of the video, I might actually swap over these ball bearings after all. But nevertheless, for the purpose of the video, I think we're almost there. So it's a case of making sure this doesn't move while tightening the lock nut. And then we are in business for that. We're going to do the other side as well and then do one final check. And now the final stage is to put the second and final crank on. Remember to put it on the opposite way round to the crank on the opposite side. And again, we're going to use the first bolt to get the crank arm all the way onto the spindle. And the same way as before, tightening up and getting everything in place. And that is us, job done. In terms of tightening the bottom bracket and making sure it's just right, honestly folks, it's kind of a feel process, putting backwards and forwards and making sure there's no play, no knocking. In terms also of that lock nut and the inner nut with the two grooves, honestly, that's trial and error. Some people find it easier to loosen the inner one, and then as they tighten the lock nut, the outer lock nut, the inner nut just turns just enough in place with it until it bites. There's no real science behind it if you're just going to use the tools available to you. But basically, if there's play, it needs to be done up more. If it's stiff to turn, you're crushing the ball bearings, and that is a definite no-no. But you'll find the happy medium. You'll be great. It's nice and easy. Don't go to the mechanics. Guys, you can do this yourselves. You can do this at home. And then you'll have hundreds, thousands more miles before it needs doing again. Anyway, I hope that's of help. Please like, please subscribe to the channel, and that will motivate me to do more videos for those of you who want to see them. Take care. Thanks for watching. See you next time.